Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tom Landwehr. I'm the Executive Director of the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters. And we're here today to give you a very high-level view of a little bit of the history of how we got to where we are, give you some perspective on our approach to permanent protection for the boundary waters, and then give you a little information on some recent really happy news that we've got on our effort to save the boundary waters from the toxic pollution from a potential sulfide-ore copper mine. I'm very happy today to be joined by Levi Lexvold. He is our Northeast Regional Organizer and the manager for our Ely headquarters. And also with Allison Flint, who is a Senior Legal Director for the Wilderness Society, an outstanding partner of ours and one that has been very prominent in the successes that we have had to date. And so, as I mentioned, we'll give you a little background on how we got to where we are today, and then we'll talk a little bit about some recent developments in our strategy going forward. And so with that, what I would like to do is I'm going to turn it over to Levi, but I'm also going to invite you to submit any questions via the chat, and we'll try to take those either as they come up or at the end as seems most appropriate. So sit back, relax, grab some popcorn, and here comes Levi from Ely.
Thank you for the introduction, Tom. I'm just going to cover some just general background information about who we are and what we do. So my name is Levi Lexvold. As Tom said, I'm up here in Ely, Minnesota, in the heart of the Superior National Forest. So up here, we're surrounded by the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness on three sides. We've got wilderness to the north, the east, and the west. And our organization is laser focused on protecting the Quetico Superior ecosystem. So what is the Quetico Superior ecosystem? It's a combination of the 3 million acre Superior National Forest, which contains the just nearly 1.1 million acre Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. We have Quetico Provincial Park just to our north, also around 1 million acres. And then to the west, we have Voyageurs National Park, which is around 218,000 acres. So all of that combined is 4.3 million acres of protected contiguous boreal forest ecosystem. And this is a landscape that is largely dominated by water. When I describe this place to people who've never been here before, I tell them it's like a giant freshwater sea with islands all over the place. Our waters here are very interconnected, whether that's through lakes, streams, rivers, our groundwater. And because of that, it is also susceptible. So what we at Save the Boundary Waters focus on, Ingrid, if you go to the next slide, please, is stopping the development of a proposed mining district in the headwaters of the Quetico Superior ecosystems. What you're seeing here on this map, we've got the boundary waters there in the center, Quetico is up to the north, and then Voyageurs to the west. And what you see there in orange is the proposed mining districts. Right now, the proposal is with Antofagasta's Twin Metals mine. And what you see there with the red flowing up to the north and the west is the path of pollution. So if this mine district is developed in the headwaters of the Quetico Superior ecosystem, that tainted water then is going to flow north to the border with Canada and then make its way west, eventually dumping in Hudson Bay in the Arctic Ocean. So the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters has been focused on putting a stop to this development since 2012. So Ingrid, if you could go to the next slide, please. So the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters is run by Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness. We are a local nonprofit organization based here in Ely, Minnesota. It was founded back in 1996. And NMW, I'll refer to that from here on, has become the conservation group in Minnesota that is the largest conservation organization in Minnesota advocating for the protection of the Quetico Superior region. And we lead the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters. So our goal is to get a permanent ban on sulfide-ore copper mining in the watershed of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. This is consistent with a lot of federal policy going back quite a way. So we've got, I mean, the Boundary Waters itself has been managed for wilderness characteristics since the 1930s. We're one of the oldest wilderness areas in the country. We were part of the original Wilderness Act in 1964, which designated 9.1 million acres of wilderness and created the National Wilderness Preservation System. Those protections were expanded first by the state in 1976. So in the boundary waters, it's a kind of a mix of federal land and state land. And in 1976, the state banned mining on state land within the Boundary Waters Canary Wilderness. In 1978, Congress passed the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness Act, which increased protections for the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, restricted some motorized use, removed incompatible uses like mining and logging, and it created 3 no mining zones basically to protect the main entry point arteries into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. So that withdrew 220,000 acres from mineral development, and that protected the Echo Trail, the Fernberg Road, and the Gunflint Trail. So we're talking about an area that's been, recognized, as being a very special, unique place, and has been garnering a lot of protection. And we see our work is expanding on those protections that are already in place. Our water, if you go back. Okay, so what I was going to say is our water here, we have some of the cleanest water in the country. When I'm in the boundary waters, for the most part, I don't bring a water filter. Okay, like I usually just drink straight from the lake. So we have, outstanding resource value waters, and no degradation of that water quality is allowed by both state and federal law. So now you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so how are we going to achieve permanent protection for the boundary waters? So we have our national goal and strategies. So the 2 mineral leases in question that are held by Antofagasta and Twin Metals were first issued back in 1966. This is prior to any of our bedrock environmental laws. They've never gone through environmental review. Our organization learned that those leases were set to expire in January 1st of 2014. And that those leases also required consent of the Forest Service. So up here, the United States Forest Service, which is in the Department of Agriculture, they manage the surface, right? The forest and the water, all that kind of stuff. The Bureau of Land Management, which is in the Department of the Interior, they manage the mineral resource. And so here in Minnesota, the Department of the Interior needs the consent of the Forest Service for mineral development to take place. And so our goal from the start was to get a 20-year mineral withdrawal of public lands and public minerals in the Boundary Waters watershed, and to then pass a permanent act through Congress. And so what we needed to do was, 1, deal with Twin Metals as leases, 2, seek a federal mineral withdrawal of the 234,000 acres within the watershed of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, and then 3rd, to pass a bill through Congress to permanently protect the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. I can see there's a question down here at the bottom. We can get to that question a little later. Okay, if you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we also have our goals at the state level. So rejection of the Twin Metals mine plan by the governor. We were successful with this during Governor Dayton's administration. He blocked access that Twin Metals was seeking to state land. And we are also trying to pass a law through the state to ban sulfide-ore copper mining in the watershed of the Boundary Waters. And then we have our MIRA lawsuit, which is the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act, and looking to amend Minnesota's non-ferrous mining rules to prohibit sulfide-ore copper mining in the watershed of the Boundary Waters. And so that lawsuit, NMW is the lead organization on that, and Tom will talk a little bit more about that later. And you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the campaign. We realized early on that in order to protect the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, we were going to need to build a national campaign. So the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, it's a federally designated wilderness area that belongs to you, me, everybody on this call, and every American, right? So this is a national issue, and the Boundary Waters has been a very important landscape in the development of conservation policy going back a century. And so we realized that we needed to build a broad and deep coalition and reach out to everybody. So that's Boundary Waters visitors, businesses, all the different camps and schools up here, like the Y camps, Voyager Bound School, area outfitters, scientists, conservation groups, the hunting and fishing community with groups like backcountry hunters and anglers, doctors. We're working with the tribes and the First Nations communities. And we've built a coalition of over 400 businesses and conservation groups advocating for boundary waters protection. We have raised this issue to the national level to be one of the 3 biggest public lands issues in the country. One of our big business partners, Patagonia, actually produced a documentary last year called Public Trust that focused on 3 landscapes. It was the Boundary Waters, Bears Ears, and Anwar. And those partnerships are really great for us to be able to spread the word, build awareness, and then activate boundary waters and wilderness supporters and conservationists to advocate for protection of the boundary waters community wilderness. So we're really laser focused on those main goals. We've built a great staff. We've got roughly 16 people. When I first started back in 2014, I think we had 3 or 4 employees, maybe a membership list of around 5,000, and now we have over 180,000 members. And then through our business and coalition partners, we're able to reach an audience of up to 18 million. So Ingrid, if you go to the next slide, please. Cool. So this is the path of pollution. So we're going to talk about this map for a little while here. So I'm here in Ely. You can kind of see that in the center of the map. And then just to the southeast, I think it's about 15 miles, is the proposed Twin Metals mine site. So the blue line you see going around here, the squiggly line, that represents the Laurentian Divide. So all the water, to the north is going to flow eventually up to Hudson Bay. Everything on the other side of the line is going to make its way down to Lake Superior. And then what you see in orange are federal prospecting permits. In red, you can see the 2 mineral leases that are held by Antofagasta and Twin Metals, the closest of which is right on the border of the Boundary Waters Community Wilderness. So that's right along the South Quishie River down the Spruce Road. And then in blue, if you can see it, there are 4 kind of ovalish looking shapes. Those would be the 4 mineral deposits that Twin Metals seeks to develop. So you've got the Spruce Road, Maturi Southwest, and then the Birch Lake deposit. For their current proposal, they're really focusing on the Maturi deposit, which is right at the tip of what we call the Quishie Triangle. So you go to the next slide, please. So this is what it looks like now. Took this photo a couple of summers ago. So this is looking directly at the proposed Twin Metals mine site. There's actually a beaver pond to the lower right of the screen, and that would be their first holding tank for contact water. And you kind of see here the proximity of the proposed site to the lake. Ingrid, if you want to go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is where they pretty much want to build the mine. Would be directly behind that tree line, about 1,000 feet. So right now, this is what it looks like out on Birch Lake. This is one of the most popular recreation lakes outside of the Boundary Waters Community Wilderness. And here you're looking at basically the center of the proposed mine site. It would be back just about 1,000 feet from the tree line, and you'd be able to see their processing facility right there. Ingrid, you can go to the next slide, please. Cool. So here in Ely, one of the big arguments we have to deal with when we're talking about pro-mine or Twin Metals advocates is the economics. So we've done, at this point, just on the science, we've got roughly 75 scientific studies, many of which are peer reviewed, that show us that if you put this mine on the edge of the boundary waters, it is going to have a very negative impact on it. But we also have to kind of contend with the kind of jobs versus environment argument that mine advocates like to bring up. And so the 2 main studies that we use are the Keylog economics study. So this is 2 PhD natural resource economists, and they really looked at what would if a Twin Metals mine was built on the edge of the Boundary Waters Community Wilderness, what would that do to the local economy? So oftentimes this kind of gets broken down into environment versus jobs, but it's really much more complicated than that. The communities in the Arrowhead, especially Ely, thrive on what I call a lifestyle economy, or an amenities-based economy. So our economic driver here is the Superior National Forest in a clean, healthy Boundary Waters Canary Wilderness. It's a huge attractor for talent, especially in the age we're all dealing with now with remote work. We've actually seen a lot of folks moving into town because now people can kind of telework from anywhere. We also have small manufacturing businesses and tons of entrepreneurs and outfitters here in the community. And they live here because of the Boundary Waters Canary Wilderness and Superior National Forest and that access to water and woods. And so the key log study really looked at what would those negative impacts to the area be. And not surprising, you also had things like decreased property values. Your property is worth a lot if you're next to a pristine wilderness area, not so much if you're next to an industrial mining district. The second study was done by Professor James Stock at Harvard. And so what he did is he analyzed what would happen over 20 years if a mineral withdrawal took place or if a mine was built. So up until then, everybody was just kind of looking at one slice in time of the economic picture. What Dr. Stock wanted to do was kind of take that out a bit further. So we looked at 20 years. He did, it was 32 economic income scenarios, ended up with 74 different scenarios that he ran. And from that, 91% of those results showed that the area was better off economically with a mineral withdrawal and a ban as opposed to building a mine. If the mine was built, you did see like a immediate spike in employment, but then it would taper off over time. And all benefits gained from that short-term employment were lost over the 20-year period. You can go to the next slide, Ingrid. Okay, so public education outreach. So this is where I spend most of my time. So I'm the Northeast Regional Organizer. So my main role here with the campaign is to build awareness and then to train our volunteers and supporters to take action and advocate for the Boundary Waters Canary Wilderness. So we have dozens of citizen advocates and partner groups that have been going to Washington, D.C. on a monthly basis up until March of 2020. So we're out there with outfitters, business owners, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, the Kids for the Boundary Waters, which have been a great group to work with, and just really advocating for boundary waters protection. So you're meeting with congresspersons, senators, staffers, and then also meeting with the land management agencies themselves. We also have what we call adventure advocacy. So this was when I first started with the campaign back in 2014. Ingrid, you can go to the next slide. So when I started in the fall of 2014, there were these two crazy folks, Dave and Amy Freeman, who were on their way in a canoe, which we named SIG, to Washington, D.C. So we've had several petition signature canoes gifted to us from Winona Canoe. They're a great business supporter of ours. And this was our second canoe. So this is SIG. We here in our headquarters in Ely have the original petition canoe, and the plan was to take that, put it on a car, and then deliver it to President Obama. Dave and Amy, met and said, well, canoes are really they're meant to be paddled, they're not meant to be driven, and so that started the paddle to DC. So Dave and Amy traveled, I think it was about 101 days from Ely, Minnesota, on the South Cushman River to Washington, D.C. And they brought this canoe with them, having events along the way, getting people to sign it. And we were able to present this to the United States Forest Service, and it was hanging in their office for a while there. Since then, Dave and Amy did Year in the Wilderness, which I was lucky enough to be the expedition manager for, the Pedal to DC, and there was another pedal tour in the state as well. It's been a really great, a very effective tool for us, actually, adventure advocacy, to help kind of spread the word and something unique about us that we do. And I think with that, I can pass it over to Tom, I believe. Yeah, next slide.
All right. Well, thank you, Levi. And Ingrid is monitoring this. Ingrid, I'm not sure if my internet connection is going to continue to be stable. So if you see a problem, please text me, and then I'll ask Levi or Allison to jump in while we're while we're transitioning here. But I want to reiterate one point that Levi made that is important to understanding all we're doing. The Boundary Waters has got amazing protections by both the federal and the state government, but that only relates to the land and water within the border of the Boundary Waters. And of course, we all know that water flows downstream. And so in a watery wilderness like the Boundary Waters, if you pollute in the watershed, even if it's outside the Boundary Waters, that will pollute the Boundary Waters. And so our whole strategy has been to protect that watershed in addition to the protections that the Boundary Water has. And so Levi outlined our strategy a little bit. Next slide, please. What I'd like to point out is that we have a multi-pronged strategy that consists of, I'm going to say, 4 puzzle pieces that in combination will get us to permanent protection. Any one of these in and of itself will not provide permanent protection, but the 4 of these in combination will provide permanent protection. And so we'll talk about some of these federal actions in more detail. So we have to terminate the 2 federal leases that Twin Metals already has. We have to look at the 20-year administrative withdrawal, and I'll mention that in a moment. That's a federal process. We need to get Congress to do a permanent withdrawal, and that is critical to ensuring enduring protection. And then also we need to look at the state level, because the federal actions only relate to federal lands, and there are state lands in here as well. Just hot off the presses, truly hot off the presses with respect to that state protection. There are 2 efforts that we're undertaking. One is we're trying to get a bill passed through the legislature, but the other is that we are trying to effect a change in the state rules related to non-ferrous mining. Right now, the state rules allow mining within a quarter mile of the Boundary Waters, and we are saying that that is absolutely not sufficient. We filed a lawsuit with the state, and just today, literally just 2 hours ago, the judge who was considering an objection from Twin Metals sided with our argument and agreed that yes, in fact, we do have the authority to move that forward. And so we've got an agreement with the Department of Natural Resources to start a public process to reconsider that rule that would hopefully ultimately prohibit mining on state lands within the watershed. So yay, big success today on that. And you'll see more about that on some of our communications that come out in the next few days. So that's the state part. And again, all 4 of these pieces really are critical to ensuring that we get to permanent protection. Next slide, please. So the first item I mentioned is a federal withdrawal process. So when you look at the land holdings in this part of the state, the watershed of the Boundary Waters, much of it is federal. Some of it is state. There's some other scattered parcels in there, but the leases that are currently held by Twin Metals are leases on federal land. So the federal government goes through a leasing process where they lease their lands for prospecting. In other words, they let people come and look for minerals, and Allison's going to talk a little bit about that. But then they carry that to an extension to allow for mining. And so a first step in protecting the Boundary Waters is to remove those federal lands from the federal government's mining process. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that happens. And could I have the next slide, please? So what is a mineral withdrawal? So again, it protects federal lands, US public lands and waters. Again, these belong to all Americans. They aren't owned by the government, they're owned by you and me. A withdrawal, which is it's a term obviously, but it's a process. It prohibits the issuance of new federal mineral leases for mining as well as for prospecting. And so it takes those lands off the table in terms of additional future mining. There are 2 kinds of mineral withdrawals. There is what's called an administrative withdrawal, and that's done by the federal government. They go through a process that takes a couple of years to consider the pros and cons. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's the permanent withdrawal, which it takes an act of Congress. Next slide, please. So that 4-part diagram mentioned the withdrawal, and this is a little bit of a diagram about how that actually would pan out. So our strategy is to get the administration to consider a administrative mineral withdrawal the mineral withdrawal study, which would start right now, or as soon as the federal government files an application. It puts a 2-year ban on mining while the study is underway. The government goes and investigates the pros and the cons of a mining ban. When it is completed, the federal government then has the discretion to say, we believe that there's more potential for harm than there is for good, so we're going to ban mining for up to 20 years. But that's only 20 years, and that can be reversed by the next administration. So we know that the only true permanent protection is to get a congressional act. So this is our 3-step process. Start the mineral withdrawal study, ideally see it through to completion, get the 20-year ban, but then work with Congress to get a permanent mining ban in the Boundary Waters watershed. Next slide, please. And so this is what it takes to do that administrative mineral withdrawal. Again, this does not require an act of Congress. It does require that the federal government, both the U.S. Forest Service, which is a branch of U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Bureau of Land Management, which is a branch of the Department of Interior, start this study. They make what's called an application, the Forest Service does, to withdraw these 234,000 acres that are the watershed for the Boundary Waters. It puts for 2 years a banning on any mining in that watershed. And then the Forest Service does this environmental analysis. They investigate the pros and the cons of taking those lands out of the federal mining program. At the end of that, the Secretary of Interior decides whether or not a 20-year withdrawal is warranted. And then should that happen, then no additional leases can be issued by the federal government. Now, the challenge with that is it does not prohibit the exercise of existing leases. And so we know that Twin Metals already has 2 existing leases, and they've already filed a mine plan on that. This would not stop that, but it would stop the issuance of new leases. Next slide, please. And so Levi showed you a little bit of this already, but the 234,328 acres of the watershed that flows into the Boundary Waters is shown by that red line. So that red line is, again, essentially the watershed of the Rainy River, the headwaters of the Rainy River. Those purple lands, those purple polygons that are shown on the north end of that are federal lands. So those are the federal land ownership. And as I mentioned, there's other scattered ownerships in there. The white is essentially private lands. Next slide, please. And so, so the administrative withdrawal would last for 20 years, which gives us the time we need to get Congress to act. And so now we need Congress. Only Congress can make a permanent withdrawal, and they do that virtually every year. And they did 2 years ago. They considered 3 different withdrawals: Metah Valley, Paradise Valley, and the Boundary Waters. And Metah Valley and Paradise Valley moved ahead with a withdrawal. The Boundary Waters did not. Next slide, please. We're very fortunate, however, in Minnesota to have a really staunch ally of protection, and that is Representative Betty McCollum, whose district is St. Paul, Ramsey County area. She has worked to put a permanent prohibition on federal land mining in the watershed of the Boundary Waters. In 2020, she introduced a bill, so this was last year, 5598, that ultimately got 47 co-sponsors and passed the U.S. House Natural Resources Committee. We had several senators who were educated about the issue. They never got to a bill introduction. So that bill had strong support. Unfortunately, at the end of the year, all the bills go away and they have to start over. So next slide, please. Fortunately, this year, Representative McCollum reintroduced that bill. It now has a new number. It's 2794. It was introduced on Earth Day, very fitting. And again, it's a federal law bill to create a federal law that would permanently prohibit sulfide-ore mining on the watershed of the Boundary Waters. To date, we have 38 co-sponsors. We are working to build that number significantly. And hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll also get that out of the relevant committees and hopefully onto the House floor. At the same time, we're working to get a Senate companion. only if we can get this bill passed by Congress, and only if we can get this signed by the president, do we get that permanent ban. So this is one of those things that we're doing a full court press on, and we are fortunate to have the support of the Wilderness Society and other partners on this. And next slide, please. And so you've seen this picture already. Again, it shows where the mine is. It shows the federal lands. It shows the withdrawal area. By withdrawing these lands from the federal mineral leasing program, we will get permanent protection into the waters of the boundary waters. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we're taking other steps as well. So we've got a bill in the state house and the state senate that would ban copper mining on state lands. So the federal withdrawal only affects federal lands. It's really a checkerboard of ownership up there. In order to get permanent protection, we need to ban mining on state lands as well. We've got several lawsuits underway in the federal level in particular, and Elson's going to talk a little bit about some of that. We believe that the Trump administration unlawfully renewed these leases that had been terminated in 2016, and we're hopeful that we will be successful in that litigation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we filed a case under the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act, alleging that the state's rules, which are required under the Environmental Rights Act to protect the environment, that in fact those rules are inadequate to protect the boundary waters, and therefore the state ought to amend those rules. That's what our victory was today. The court said, yes, you've got a legitimate concern here. The DNR should undertake the process that you've agreed to reconsider those rules. And so that's our state approach that's on right now. Next slide, please. As Levi mentioned, none of this is possible without significant support from people who love the boundary waters. We're very fortunate to have a very active group of kids for the boundary waters. We've got colleague organizations like the Wilderness Society, National Wildlife Federation, Sportsmen for the Boundary Waters, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, any number of partners that are working for the same outcome. And ultimately, these decisions will be made by elected and appointed officials. And so the voice of you, the voice of Americans and Minnesotans is very, very important. And I think the next slide, I think I am going to now turn it over to our outstanding colleague and extraordinarily brilliant attorney, Allison Flint.
Well, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Flint. I'm our Senior Legal Director at the Wilderness Society. Based in Colorado, but I grew up in Minneapolis and spent many formative summers in the Boundary Waters, including leading wilderness trips there for YMCA Camp Widgiewagon throughout my summers in college. So it's really just a pleasure to be working on this issue professionally now, given my focus on public lands issues and legal issues all across the United States. So the Wilderness Society is the only national environmental group that's really had a singular focus for decades on our shared national or public lands. So those are the federal lands managed by agencies like the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. Our focus today, you can see our mission on this slide, uniting people to protect America's wild places, focused on making public lands a solution to the climate and species extinction crises by really trying to secure and protect a continental network of resilient landscapes. And also transforming conservation policy and practice so that all people benefit equitably from public lands. And we think protecting the boundary waters really plays an important formative role in achieving those goals. We do that work by collaborating with local communities, with grassroots and local organizations like Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness, with tribes and with the federal public land management agencies to advocate for the policies and decisions that protect places like the boundary waters. And protecting the boundary waters from the threat of sulfide-ore copper mining remains a top priority for our organization, and we've played a very active role in the campaign to save the boundary waters since its creation to address this threat. So next slide. little bit, sorry, some of my font got into funny sizes. The TWS is very small there, but TWS stands for the Wilderness Society. Just very briefly about our sort of history and connections to the Boundary Waters. It really goes back to our founding in 1935 by a number of sort of wilderness advocates, many of whom had deep connections to the upper Midwest and to the Quetico Superior canoe country in particular. Folks like Ernest Oberholzer, who was a Minnesotan and served on our board for 30 years. Aldo Leopold, sort of considered the godfather of wilderness, had upper Midwest roots. Bob Marshall served on Franklin Roosevelt's Quetico Superior Committee starting in 1934, before he founded the Wilderness Society a year later. And then Sigurd Olson, remember the canoe picture from Amy and Dave Freeman, was named Sig after Sigurd Olson. He was also a founding member of the Wilderness Society and served as our president in the 1960s and into 1971. He also was the inaugural recipient of our organization's highest honor, the Robert Marshall Award, in 1981. And so in close partnership with groups like Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness and others, we've played a really critical role in initial designation of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness as part of the 1964 Wilderness Act, and later in its additional protection through the 1978 Boundary Waters Wilderness Act. So next slide. A little bit more about that history. We were, our founders and early leaders got really tired of trying to achieve piecemeal protections for our wildest and most untouched lands, including from threats like mining, logging, and other pressures. And so in the 1950s, the Wilderness Society and Boundary Waters protection leaders really started to lobby for a way to permanently protect these types of lands, with the Boundary Waters and canoe country being very central in those efforts. And the result was the 1964 Wilderness Act, which created the National Wilderness Preservation System and identified about 9 million acres that kind of served as the inaugural components of that system, with the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness being one of those. The principal author of the Wilderness Act was TWS Executive Director Howard Zahniser, and Sigurd Olson and others played very central roles as well. Next slide. So today, this system, this National Wilderness Preservation System, provides permanent protection for approximately 110 million acres of federal public lands. You can see there some of the language from the Act that talks about what wilderness is and what it isn't. And certainly the Boundary Waters is a shining example of this. And just to talk a little bit more about sort of that national significance piece, Levi touched on this a bit, but the Boundary Waters, if you look at this map, it's hard to see at this scale, but it's our largest designated wilderness area east of the Rockies and north of the Everglades. It's our only major lakeland wilderness. And as Levi talked about, just the abundance of interconnected freshwater, the surrounding Superior National Forest in the Boundary Waters holds 20% of the freshwater of the entire national forest system. So we're talking about 3 million acres out of 193 million acres. You got a fifth of all of the freshwater. It's also the most popular wilderness area in America. It has the highest yearly visitation of any area in this National Wilderness Preservation System. And one of the reasons for that is it's one of the most accessible wilderness areas. So it plays a really important role in connecting diverse groups of Americans to nature, from veterans to youth to the disabled community. I took my 2-year-old into the wilderness a few summers ago, and it was just fine. And you can't do that with other wilderness experiences. And then as part of that broader 4.3 million acre protected boreal forest landscape that Levi talked about, it also plays a really unique and important role in sequestering carbon and buffering against the impacts of climate change. And so to those ends, its permanent protection, right, achieving that perfect piece of those four puzzle pieces that Tom talked about is really crucial to satisfying not only the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters goals, but also the Biden administration's broader goals and commitments to protecting 30% of US lands and waters by 2030 as one of the key components to addressing the climate and extinction crises. So in most instances, right, once we get an area designated as wilderness, which is the highest level of conservation protection that's available under federal law, the area remains free from major threats that would damage its natural or unspoiled character. But again, that's not always the case. And here, as Tom talked about, if you cite a sulfide-ore copper mine in the headwaters of this type of wilderness and this water-rich interconnected environment, you are threatening directly the natural and unspoiled character, right? Those components of what makes it wilderness that are talked about in the quote I have up there from the Wilderness Act. So given the Boundary Waters national significance and this grave threat posed by sulfide-ore copper mining in its headwaters, the Wilderness Society has been fully committed to honoring the legacy of our founders and our early leaders and ensuring that this crown jewel of the National Wilderness Preservation System is protected from one of the world's most polluting industries. And so again, we've been supporting and working closely with the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters on nearly all of those pieces of the puzzle in terms of the path to permanent protection. Next slide. And we're making progress. So Tom highlighted the victory at the state level, but also just the day before that, earlier this week, we have another very timely example of success and an important early victory along that path to permanent protection. So as Tom mentioned, sort of the precursor to a mine on the Superior National Forest, the kind of first step is for a company to seek what's called a prospecting permit, which allows them to go out on the landscape, drill holes, explore for minerals, and basically accumulate the information that they would need to acquire a federal mineral lease, which then can lead to seeking and potentially obtaining a mining permit, which is what then would allow them to break ground and build a mine. And so we're hopeful we must stop a twin metals mine from being approved, but if it were approved, right, there's all these other prospecting permits hanging out there that could lead to future expansion of the mine, any mine that is approved. And this includes 13 permits that cover about 15,000 acres. It's on this map, the kind of light yellow color. And so what you see here is the mining district, right? The two existing leases in kind of that green aqua color and then the red. And then you see all of this yellow, including leading up right adjacent to the wilderness boundary. And so that's the future of a twin metals mine. And the Trump administration just about a year ago extended those prospecting permits and gave twin metals the right to do additional activity on them for 4 more years. But in doing so, it completely ignored governing legal requirements. It didn't conduct any environmental analysis or consultation around impacts to endangered species or public process. And so we, along with the Center for Biological Diversity and Northeastern Minnesotans for Wilderness, filed a lawsuit, and the Department of Justice, which is the lawyers for the federal government, agreed with us. They said, yeah, you got good claims. We can't defend this. And so earlier this week, we reached a settlement agreement with the Biden administration that requires, in this case, the Bureau of Land Management, which was the agency that extended the permits, to go back and start over again and do that required environmental review and make a new decision about whether to extend those permits. And so in the coming months, this is going to be an opportunity for the public to weigh in and talk about the impacts and say why this type of activity does not belong in this location, so that the Biden administration, while following proper lawful process and informed decision-making, can make a new decision. So it's a great first step, But as Tom alluded to, the Biden administration on that federal piece of the puzzle has a lot of work ahead to repair the damage of the last 4 years and protect this irreplaceable resource. And so that includes action that needs to be taken related to the 2 existing leases on this map shown in, again, that aqua color and the red color. And then also really initiating and taking that step to put in place an administrative designation. And so that is really where my expertise comes in, and we'll be continuing to support those efforts and advocate for, real restoration from the last 4 years of science-based decision-making, valuing public input. And so we'll certainly need all the help we can get from members of the public in upcoming opportunities that we hope we'll have soon.
Hey,
So
Allison,
thank you very much. Yep.
Before you leave that slide, I think 2 things I'd ask you to comment on. One is that people can see how disassociated those 2 leases are. And Twin Metals was vying for a lease that connects those up. And also, what rights does it give them in the future once they have secured a prospecting lease, and why is it so important to stop that?
Yeah, well, you're getting at 2 things there, Tom. So the first piece is is the yellow in between the aqua and the red. So that is actually an application for a 3rd new lease that Twin Metals is seeking. And we believe that 3rd lease is really important, right, to connect up their existing rights under the 2 leases. And in fact, a lot of the infrastructure for the mine in the proposed mine plan that the company submitted back in January of 2019 includes that 3rd lease. So there is a proposal in front of now the Biden administration, was the Trump administration, not only to permit the mine, but to grant that 3rd lease. So that's a bit different from the prospecting permits, which are sort of the things that could lead to a 4th lease and a 5th lease and a 6th lease. And we need to tackle all of that. But I think the interesting interconnected piece of the puzzle here is that if we get that administrative withdrawal in place again, and that decision-making process started, it triggers a temporary pause on new leasing and permitting. And because that 3rd lease that Antofagasta, that the company wants, shown in the brighter yellow color here, not kind of the straw color, would be a new lease, it would stop the Biden administration from being able to issue that lease. Both, temporarily under an administrative withdrawal and until a permanent withdrawal is put in place. So lots of interconnected pieces of the puzzle. I'm just trying to catch up on some of the questions here to see if we can help answer.
So Allison, when the prospecting lease is granted, it carries with it some tentacles that leads to preference rate leasing. Is that correct?
The prospecting permits can. So, I mean, the way that the process works under the law, if it's not withdrawn, right, is that a company seeks a prospecting permit that allows them to go out on the landscape and conduct some surface disturbing activity, which they need to be transparent with the federal agencies about, right? They can potentially cut a new access road and drill some core samples, some holes into the ground to pull out core samples and other types of activities. And then once they make a discovery of a valuable mineral deposit and prove that up, then they're entitled under the law to seek a lease. Now, importantly, the law doesn't require the government to issue that lease. They need to go through a process of analyzing all the impacts, and then make an informed decision, right? Both a Forest Service decision and a Bureau of Land Management decision about whether whether that activity and leasing makes sense in this location, given the impacts, given the other resources and uses of the forests that are at stake. So that's now the decision that's sitting in front of the agencies with respect to that third lease. We're not that far yet with these prospecting permits, but we're trying to prevent that sort of situation where we might have a fourth lease or a fifth lease sitting out there being considered.
Excellent. Did you have any more slides there, Allison?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Happy to,
Well,
yeah, take any questions.
yes, thank you very much for that. And so this is a whole lot of information. We understand that these administrative processes are very complicated and sometimes challenging to understand. We try to put them into those simple diagrams so people can understand how they are interrelated and how each one is important and how we're working on them. Happy to take any questions now. Obviously, you know, with the development yesterday and the development today, there is a lot going on, and we know it's a little hard to keep up, but we endeavor to make sure that everybody knows what's going on, so you can actively engage at the appropriate times. And so, as we mentioned, I think both in the permitting process, Allison, as well as in the state process that I mentioned earlier, there will be an opportunity for public involvement, public input. And so we will put out information when those public comment times are available, and summarize some of the issues that people can be, should be weighing in on. And so that is a little bit of an update. Question: key legislators that must be pushed to support clean water. Well, and of course we have electeds at both the federal and the state level. You know, we at the federal level, I'll tackle that first because that is a little bit easier. Of course, Betty McCollum has been a strong supporter since the beginning. On her bill, we also have Elon Omar and Dean Phillips as co-sponsors. So we have 3 out of our 8 congressional House members that are signed on. So obviously the 5 that are not signed on are people we would like to encourage to do that. And neither of our senators has sponsored a bill yet. Now I'll offer that Senator Smith has submitted a letter in support of a mineral withdrawal to the administration. So we're thankful for that. But so far, Senator Klobuchar has been fairly quiet on this. And so obviously those are 2 people we want to continue to work with. At the state level, we've had quite a good reception to our state bill, and at least in the House. And we have a smaller subset of legislators in the Senate who have signed on to a Senate companion. In both cases, they are all Democrats. So obviously, one of the big challenges that we've got, especially in a divided legislature, is getting Republican support. So I would say, regardless of where you are living, whoever your legislator is, I would say communication to their office to let them know that you support protection for the boundary waters is really the best thing you can do at this point, and hold them accountable to support that. Any other questions? Well, if not, do feel free at any time to send us a question at email. You can just send that to info@savetheboundarywaters.org. I believe we will be recording this, and we'll be putting out some communication so people who were not able to watch today will have an opportunity to view it later. I want to again express my thanks to you all for paying attention. To the people who watch these webinars are our most ardent supporters, and we very, very much appreciate your support. We could not do it without you. We try to be the voice for all of you individuals and work through great partners like the Wilderness Society and some of our pro bono attorneys and others. So thank you very much. Thank you as well to Allison and Levi for joining us today. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please do direct them to our info at savetheboundarywatch.org email address, and we'll try to get you a response. With that, I think we'll call it a day and wish you all a really wonderful rest of your day. Thanks all.